The climate burden is a heavy load for Africa, yet this continent is the least responsible for the devastating effects of climate change. Africa accounts for just 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, despite making up 17% of the world's population. Rich nations in the G7 and G20 are responsible for more than 80% of global carbon dioxide emissions. These wealthy countries must confront this climate injustice, especially as we approach the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow in November. African nations need assistance to build resilience to adapt to the impacts of climate change. This is a matter of life and death, and a debt owed to us by rich nations. Leaders from developing countries representing 50% of the world's nations have already placed their demands on the table in preparation for COP26 negotiations. These countries have presented a 5-point plan to make COP26 a success. It covers the need for greater climate finance, more focus on adaptation, loss and damage, emission reductions, and the implementation of the Paris Agreement to solve the climate crisis that is impoverishing developing countries. It is a response to rich nations' lack of urgency and failure to make binding commitments to tackle the climate crisis. Wealthy countries promised to provide $100 billion a year by 2020 to assist poor nations. This financial assistance was meant to help poor countries adjust to the effects of climate change, receive compensation for loss and damage as a result of extreme weather, and transition to low-carbon economies. But that promise has not been kept. This is why developing countries have come up with a Solidarity Package 5-point plan demanding 1. Cutting emissions, an acceleration of net zero targets led by those with the biggest responsibility and capacity. 2. Finance. Developed countries must honor their promise to pay at least $100 billion per year by 2020, with increased annual sums from 2025. 3. Adaptation. At least 50% of climate finance needs to be committed to helping the most vulnerable countries adapt. 4. Loss and damage. The consequences of the developed world's historical failure to cut emissions are already resulting in permanent losses and damage for the most vulnerable countries. Rich countries need to pay for these. 5. Implementation. By COP26, governments must set a 5-year time frame for delivering new goals to reduce emissions. Without this 5-point plan, the outcome of the Glasgow summit will be a big failure. But there's still hope for the world. But that will require fairness and honesty on the part of the wealthy countries.